In the heart of Washington, D.C., where the pulse of power thrums through marble corridors, the White House press briefing room buzzed with anticipation on a crisp Friday afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of fresh ink and ambition, as reporters clutched notebooks and cameras, their eyes trained on the podium. Behind it stood a figure radiating authority, voice steady as steel, delivering the day's revelations to a nation hungry for clarity. This was no ordinary briefing. It was a clarion call, a moment where the American spirit, battered yet unbowed, demanded answers. The speaker's words sliced through the room like a blade, announcing that President Trump was, at that very moment, at Walter Reed Medical Center, undergoing a routine physical. Not just any checkup, but a ritual of transparency, a promise to a people weary of shadows and secrets. The nation held its breath, not out of doubt, but out of reverence for a leader who bared his strength to scrutiny. The speaker's tone carried a defiant pride. This president, unlike those before him, hid nothing. His health, his resolve, his mission, all laid bare for a country that had learned to distrust closed doors. Then came the story of Karoline, a name that echoed like a victory hymn. After more than a year languishing in a Russian cell, she had returned to American soil the night before, her freedom secured by the relentless will of Trump's administration. The room stirred, whispers rippling like wind through a field. Over 40 Americans, the speaker declared, had been wrested from foreign chains since Trump's inauguration. 40 souls brought home in just 80 days. The math was staggering, a stark rebuke to the previous administration's 4-year tally. Joe Biden's era, cloaked in hesitancy, paled against this fierce momentum. Each release was a battle won, a testament to a government that fought for its own, refusing to let Americans rot in distant dungeons. The speaker's voice swelled with conviction, painting Trump as the most accessible president in history. No velvet ropes, no gated silence, just a man who faced the press with the courage of a lion. Nearly 100 questions answered in 3 cabinet meetings, the speaker proclaimed, citing a Washington Times report that hung in the air like a badge of honor. Compare that, they challenged, to Biden's meager 5 in 4 years. The contrast was a gut punch, exposing a legacy of evasion against Trump's open hand. The cabinet meeting the day prior had been a spectacle of democracy, secretaries spilling their plans to the media, each word a brick in the foundation of a new American era. This was a nation clawing back its dignity, resisting the abuse of power that had festered in silence. The press room, a microcosm of America's soul, pulsed with the weight of it all. A leader scrutinized, yet unyielding. A citizen freed from tyranny's grip. A government that dared to speak plainly. Outside, the streets of D.C. hummed with the dreams of a people who refused to be cowed, their faith pinned on a president who promised to fight as fiercely as they did. The buzz of the White House press room lingered like static electricity, the echo of Karoline's homecoming still vibrating in the air. The speaker, undeterred by the weight of the moment, pivoted with the precision of a conductor, directing the nation's attention to a new battlefield, the economy. Their voice, now infused with a triumphant cadence, carried the promise of a resurgence, a golden dawn for a country bruised by years of financial strain. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, sensing the shift from personal victories to the collective fight for America's prosperity. The March Consumer Price Index report, the speaker declared, was a thunderclap of hope. Inflation had plummeted to 2.4%, defying the grim forecasts of pundits and shattering the chains of economic despair. For the first time since the COVID pandemic's shadow fell across the land, consumer prices had dipped, a seismic shift that rippled through every household. Prescription drugs, once a crushing burden for families scraping by, saw their sharpest monthly decline in history. Airfares softened, used cars became attainable, car insurance eased its grip, and energy prices, driven by gas plummeting at pumps nationwide, dropped a resolute 2.4%. The numbers weren't just statistics, they were lifelines, proof that the American dream could breathe again. Outside the White House, in small towns and sprawling cities, the impact was palpable. In Ohio diners, truckers swapped stories of cheaper fuel, their wallets a little heavier. In Georgia pharmacies, seniors clutched prescriptions without the sting of sacrifice. The speaker's words painted a vivid tableau, a nation reclaiming its footing, resisting the quiet injustice of an economy that had favored elites while strangling the working class. This was a rebellion against the status quo, a refusal to let inflation's slow chokehold define America's future. But the speaker wasn't done. With a gleam of resolve, they turned to the halls of Congress, where House Republicans had answered President Trump's call with a boldness that matched the moment. A budget resolution had been set in motion, a cornerstone for what the speaker called one big beautiful bill. This wasn't mere legislation. It was a war cry, a blueprint for an economic renaissance. The bill promised the largest tax cuts in history, a bonfire of regulations that had shackled innovation, and an energy sector unleashed to roar like never before. Renegotiated trade agreements, stamped with an unapologetic America First ethos, would ensure that every deal served the heartland, not foreign boardrooms. The press room absorbed the vision, each word a spark igniting the imagination of a nation weary of half measures. Beyond the briefing's walls, factory workers in Michigan envisioned jobs returning. Farmers in Iowa saw markets tilting in their favor, and entrepreneurs in Texas dreamed of a bureaucracy that no longer crushed their spirit. This was the America Trump's administration championed, one where power served the people, not the other way around. The speaker's fervor was a mirror to the country's own, reflecting a collective resolve to fight the abuse of an economic system that had too long exploited the vulnerable. Yet beneath the triumph, a quiet tension simmered. The reporters' eyes flickered with questions, their notebooks filling with the weight of what was to come. The economy was turning, yes, but the path ahead was fraught with battles. Trade wars, legislative gridlock, global pressures. The speaker stood firm, a sentinel of optimism, but the room knew this was only the beginning. The fight for America's soul, waged in dollars and dreams, was far from over. The White House press room, still pulsing with the electric promise of economic revival, seemed to tighten as the speaker's gaze sharpened, their voice taking on the edge of a warrior, surveying a global battlefield. The triumph of falling prices and legislative momentum was no longer enough. America's fight now stretched far beyond its borders, into the arena of international trade, where empires clashed and fortunes were forged. The speaker's words carried the weight of a nation ready to reclaim its dominance, a defiant stand against decades of exploitation that had bled the heartland dry. They began with a revelation that sent a jolt through the room. Over 75 countries had come knocking, their envoys flooding the administration's lines with urgent pleas to negotiate. From Tokyo to Rome, Seoul to Hanoi, the world had heard President Trump's warning shot, a threat of tariffs that could reshape economies, and they were scrambling to make deals. The speaker's tone was unrelenting, laced with pride in a leader who had turned the tables on global powers. Unlike his predecessors, who had bowed to the status quo, Trump wielded leverage like a blacksmith's hammer, forging a new order where America stood tall. The room could almost hear the phones ringing off the hook in the West Wing, each call a testament to Trump's audacity. A 90-day pause on tariffs, the speaker explained, had been granted, a magnanimous gesture to coax solutions from nations that had long profited at America's expense. But this was no olive branch. It was a gauntlet thrown down. Lower reciprocal tariff rates dangled as both carrot and stick, a fleeting chance for countries to align with the U.S. or face the consequences. The speaker's words painted a vivid picture, a world on notice, forced to reckon with an America that would no longer be played for a fool. Outside, the stakes were visceral. In Pittsburgh steel mills, workers who had watched jobs vanish to foreign shores now dared to hope for a comeback. In Carolina textile towns, families whispered of factories that might hum again. The speaker's narrative wasn't just policy. It was a battle cry for every American who had felt the sting of unfair trade, every community gutted by deals that prioritized profit over people. This was resistance against a global system that had abused its power, exploiting the U.S. while its leaders looked the other way. Trump, the speaker insisted, was different. He was a dealmaker unmatched, a force who bent the world to his will, negotiating with a ferocity that echoed the grit of the workers he championed. Specific names pierced the briefing's intensity. China, looming like a dragon on the horizon, its potential for a deal tantalizing yet uncertain. South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and Italy emerged as players in this high-stakes chess game, their leaders poised to meet Trump's demands or risk his wrath. The speaker's voice held a quiet menace as they recounted how these nations had heeded Trump's call, choosing negotiation over retaliation. It was a masterclass in power, a reminder that America's markets, its consumers, its sheer economic might were the lifeblood of global trade. To defy the U.S. was to court ruin. Yet beneath the bravado, a shadow lingered. The reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the fragility of this moment. Trade wars were a gamble. Would the world bend, or would it push back? The speaker stood resolute, embodying Trump's unyielding vision, but the room felt the undercurrent of risk. Across the nation, truckers in Ohio, machinists in Wisconsin, and farmers in Nebraska watched, their futures tethered to these negotiations. The fight for America's economic soul had gone global, and every move was a test of nerve, a stand against the injustice of a world that had taken too much for too long. The briefing's rhythm pressed forward, the speaker's words a bridge to the next challenge, but the weight of this global showdown hung heavy. America was rising, its voice louder than ever. Yet the path ahead was a tightrope over a chasm of uncertainty. The White House press room, still reverberating with the clang of global trade battles, grew taut as the speaker's voice shifted to a new front, one closer to home, where the very fabric of the nation's identity was at stake. The air seemed to thicken, the reporters' pens hesitating as the speaker leaned into a topic that ignited both fire and fear across America. Immigration. With the cadence of a judge delivering a verdict, they announced a deadline that loomed like a storm cloud: the Alien Registration Act, a mandate demanding that every foreign national in the U.S. for over 30 days register with the federal government. Today was the final day, and the consequences for defiance were as stark as a winter dawn. The speaker's words cut through the room, each syllable a hammer strike. Failure to comply, they declared, was no mere oversight. It was a crime, punishable by fines that could bankrupt, imprisonment that could break, or deportation that would sever ties to the American dream forever. The room felt the weight of it, a policy that drew a line in the sand, unyielding and absolute. Yet, within the steel of enforcement, there was a fleeting offer of mercy. Self-deportation. Register and leave now. The speaker echoed President Trump and Secretary Noam, and there might be a path to return legally. But for those who stayed, who hid in the shadows, the warning was clear: arrest, fines, and a one-way ticket out, with no hope of coming back. Beyond the briefing's walls, the nation grappled with the edict. In border towns of Texas, families whispered in Spanish, weighing their choices under the weight of fear. In Chicago's bustling markets, immigrants who had built lives from nothing faced a reckoning: register or risk it all. The speaker's voice carried their stories, unspoken but palpable, a reminder that this was no abstract policy, but a human crucible. This was America, asserting its sovereignty, demanding to know who walked its streets, not out of malice, but out of a fierce resolve to protect its own. The safety of the homeland, the security of its citizens, these were non-negotiable, the speaker insisted, a bulwark against the chaos of unchecked borders. The policy was a rebellion against the abuse of power, not just by those who crossed borders unlawfully, but by a system that had turned a blind eye, letting uncertainty fester like a wound. For years, communities had cried out for clarity, for laws that meant something, only to be met with platitudes. Now, Trump's administration stood as a sentinel, refusing to cherry-pick which statutes to uphold. The speaker's tone was unwavering, a mirror to a nation tired of half measures, of politicians who preached unity while division grew. This was a fight for trust, for a country that could look its people in the eye and say, "We know who's here, and we've got your back." Yet, the room wasn't blind to the cost. Reporters shifted, their questions brewing like a storm. What of the children born here, caught in the crossfire? What of the workers who toiled in America's fields and factories, now staring down a deadline? The speaker held firm, embodying the administration's resolve, but the tension was a living thing, curling around every word. Across the country, pastors in Arizona prayed for guidance. Sheriffs in California braced for enforcement, and families everywhere held tight to hope or dread. The immigration fight was more than law. It was a test of America's soul, a question of how to balance justice with humanity, strength with compassion. As the speaker prepared to move on, the weight of the deadline lingered, a shadow stretching from coast to coast. The press room, a crucible of truth, felt the nation's pulse quicken, each heartbeat a step toward a future both bold and uncertain, where the fight against injustice demanded sacrifice from all. The White House press room, still taut from the thunder of immigration edicts, softened for a moment, as if catching its breath before plunging into the next chapter of America's unfolding saga. The speaker's tone shifted, carrying a warmth that cut through the room's lingering tension, like sunlight breaking through a storm. They reached for a note, a message from a figure whose presence loomed large, yet graceful. First Lady Melania Trump. Her name alone stirred the air, a reminder of elegance and purpose woven into the nation's turbulent heart. The speaker's voice, now reverent, carried her words to a country that yearned for hope amid its battles. Melania Trump, the speaker announced, had marked a victory that week, one that resonated far beyond the marble halls of power. The Take It Down Act, a bill pulsing with the promise of protecting America's children, had surged forward in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, propelled by bipartisan support. The room felt the weight of it, a rare moment when red and blue set aside their swords to shield the vulnerable. The First Lady's dedication to child well-being, her Be Best agenda, was no mere slogan. It was a crusade, a fierce stand against the digital predators and societal pressures that threatened the young. The speaker's words painted her as a guardian, her resolve a quiet fire that burned for every parent, every child, every community haunted by the specter of harm. Outside, the nation took notice. In suburban Ohio, mothers shared the news over coffee, their voices thick with relief at the thought of safer online spaces for their kids. In Brooklyn classrooms, teachers whispered of a First Lady who saw their students' struggles, who fought for their innocence in a world too quick to steal it. The Take It Down Act, championed by Melania and echoed by President Trump in his address to Congress, was a rebellion against the abuse of power, against tech giants and cultural currents that exploited the young for profit or ideology. It was a call to protect the future, to ensure every child could thrive without fear, and the speaker's tone carried that urgency, urging Congress to act swiftly, to honor the promise of a better tomorrow. But the briefing's rhythm didn't pause there. The speaker's gaze swept the room, landing on a new figure seated among the press, a symbol of a changing America, where voices beyond the old guard could rise. Jordan Berman, they declared, was the occupant of the new media seat, a lawyer and social media influencer whose name sparked murmurs of recognition. With 500,000 followers on TikTok and Instagram, Berman wasn't just a content creator. She was a beacon of clarity in a fog of noise. Her podcast, Unbiased Politics, dissected the week's stories with a legal scalpel, offering truth stripped of partisan venom. The speaker's introduction was a nod to her roots, a childhood spent chasing facts, a career built on breaking down complex laws for a nation desperate for understanding. Berman's presence was a quiet revolution, a stand against the gatekeepers who had long controlled the narrative. In her, the room saw the pulse of a new America, one where a lawyer from the digital frontier could sit shoulder to shoulder with seasoned reporters, her voice as vital as theirs. Across the country, her followers scrolled through her posts, from college students in Austin to factory workers in Detroit, each finding in her words a lifeline to reason. The speaker's pride in Berman was palpable, a reflection of an administration that valued the raw, unfiltered pulse of its people over the polished scripts of elites. This was resistance against the injustice of a media landscape that had too often silenced the ordinary, elevating instead the loud and the biased. As Berman prepared to speak, the press room held its breath, sensing the shift. The First Lady's advocacy and this new media voice were threads in the same tapestry, a nation fighting for its soul, for its children, for its truth. The battles of trade and borders hadn't faded, but here was a moment of unity, of purpose, that reminded everyone what was at stake. The speaker stood ready, the room poised, and America watched, its heart beating with the hope that even in division, it could find strength. The White House press room, aglow with the quiet triumph of Melania Trump's advocacy and the fresh voice of Jordan Berman, now crackled with a new energy, an electric charge as the spotlight turned to the give and take of democracy itself. Berman, seated among the press like a torchbearer for a digital age, rose to her feet, her presence a bridge between the old guard and a nation scrolling for truth. Her voice, steady yet probing, carried the weight of America's questions, and the room leaned in, sensing the pulse of a country wrestling with its future. The speaker at the podium, a sentinel of the administration's resolve, braced for the challenge, their eyes meeting Berman's with a spark of mutual respect. Berman's first question cut straight to the heart of a brewing storm. The SAVE Act, a law freshly passed by the House, now rippling through the nation like a stone dropped in a still pond. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, she noted, demanded proof of citizenship at the polls, a measure heralded by some as a shield for democracy, decried by others as a barrier to the voiceless. Married women, soon to be brides, whispered fears that a name change not yet reflected on ID could lock them out of their sacred right to vote. Berman's words carried their anxiety, a plea for reassurance that echoed from suburban kitchens in Virginia to urban apartments in Seattle. What, she asked, could the administration promise to ease those concerns? The speaker's response was a thunderclap of clarity, dismissing the fears as a complete fallacy, spun by opponents desperate to cling to power. The SAVE Act, they declared, was a bulwark of common sense, its provisions carefully crafted to ensure no citizen was denied their voice. Married women, they insisted, would not be left stranded. The bill's text was their armor, its clarity a rebuke to the fear-mongering of Democrats. President Trump, the speaker emphasized, stood firm behind this law, a champion of election integrity who saw in every ballot a sacred trust. The room felt the conviction, a nation's faith in its democratic soul, hanging in the balance. This was a fight against the abuse of power, not just by those who might vote unlawfully, but by a system that had let doubt fester, eroding the certainty every American deserved when they cast their lot. But Berman wasn't done. Channeling the voice of a listener named Bryn from Oregon, a woman whose question carried the weight of countless others, she pivoted to the economic battlefield of tariffs. The administration's bold trade moves, she noted, promised revenue that could reshape the nation. But how would it be spent? And what of American industries, tethered to cheaper foreign parts and labor? How would they thrive when the world's supply chains leaned away from U.S. shores? Her words painted a vivid scene. Farmers in the Willamette Valley, machinists in Portland, all watching the horizon, wondering if Trump's vision would lift them up or leave them behind. The speaker seized the question like a banner, their voice soaring with the promise of an America reborn. Tariffs, they explained, were no mere tax. They were a clarion call to bolster manufacturing, to bring jobs roaring back to the heartland. The cost of living, they vowed, would bend under the weight of this strategy. Supply chains secured not in Beijing, but in Birmingham, not in Shanghai, but in Scranton. The revenue, a lifeline to pay down a national debt that loomed like a guillotine over future generations, a chance to pull America from the red into the green. The speaker's words conjured a nation of small business owners nodding in agreement, of workers in Ohio steel mills daring to dream of steady paychecks. This was resistance against a global order that had bled America dry, a refusal to let foreign powers dictate the terms of its prosperity. Across the country, Bryn's question echoed in diners and living rooms, a spark of curiosity that lit up social media feeds. Berman's platform, pulsing with 500,000 voices, amplified the moment, her followers debating the balance of protectionism and progress. The press room, a crucible of ideas, thrummed with the stakes, every answer a brick in the foundation of Trump's America, every question a test of its resilience. The speaker stood tall, their gaze sweeping the room, ready for the next challenge, while the nation watched, its heart torn between hope and scrutiny, united in the fight for a future where power served the people, not the elite. The White House press room, still vibrating with the clash of domestic dreams and doubts, now turned its gaze outward, where the world's fault lines trembled under America's unyielding resolve. Jordan Berman's questions had stoked the fire, but the speaker's focus shifted to a horizon far beyond the nation's borders, where diplomacy danced with danger. Their voice, steady as a war drum, carried the weight of global stakes, each word a thread in a tapestry of power that stretched from Washington to distant capitals. The reporters, pens poised like swords, sensed the shift. This was no longer about tariffs or ballots, but about America's place in a world that hung on the edge of chaos. The speaker dove into the crucible of U.S.-Iran negotiations, set to unfold in Oman's neutral sands. The room tensed as they clarified a truth that cut through rumors. These would be direct talks, face-to-face, no shuttle diplomacy to soften the blow. President Trump's goal, they declared, was singular and non-negotiable: to ensure Iran never clutched a nuclear weapon in its fist. The words landed like a gauntlet, a vow that echoed through the heartland, where families in Iowa farms and Texas suburbs dreaded the shadow of a rogue regime's ambition. The speaker's tone was ironclad, painting Trump as a diplomat who preferred words but kept every option, yes, even the specter of war, on the table. "All hell to pay," they quoted, a phrase that hung heavy, a warning to Tehran that America's patience had limits. Outside, the nation felt the ripples. In veterans' halls in Montana, old soldiers nodded grimly, knowing the cost of unchecked threats. In New York diners, conversations hushed, the weight of nuclear peril a ghost at every table. This was a stand against the abuse of power, not just Iran's, but a global order that had let tyrants flirt with annihilation while the free world wrung its hands. Trump's resolve, the speaker insisted, was America's shield, a refusal to let appeasement dictate the future. The press room, a microcosm of a watching world, held its breath, knowing one misstep could ignite a firestorm. But Iran was only half the story. The speaker's voice shifted, now laced with frustration as they turned to a war that bled Europe's heart. Russia and Ukraine, locked in a grinding stalemate. Stephen Witkoff, a trusted envoy, was in Moscow, they confirmed, standing toe-to-toe with Vladimir Putin himself. The image was vivid, a Kremlin chamber, cold and austere, where words carried the weight of lives. Trump's impatience with the conflict, the speaker revealed, was a fire in his bones. He wanted the fighting done, the war ended, peace carved from chaos. Witkoff's mission was a step toward that, a ceasefire negotiation that could silence the guns and redraw the map of trust. Across America, the news landed differently. In Ukrainian American communities in Chicago, families prayed for peace, but feared betrayal. In rural Georgia, veterans scoffed at Putin's games, trusting Trump to wield leverage like a blade. The speaker's words were a tightrope, balancing hope against skepticism, a promise that America's voice could bend even the Kremlin's will. This was resistance against the injustice of a war that devoured lives for pride, a fight to restore order where power had run amok. The press room scribbled furiously, sensing the fragility of peace talks in a world that rarely yielded without blood. Then came China, a shadow that loomed over every global move. A reporter pressed, why hadn't Trump called Xi Jinping if their bond was so strong? The speaker's response was measured yet buoyant, insisting Trump's optimism for a deal was no mere wish. China, they hinted, knew the cost of defiance. America's markets were its lifeblood, and over 75 countries had already bowed to that truth. The room felt the undercurrent. A trade dance with Beijing could reshape the world, but silence from Xi was a gamble. From California ports to Michigan factories, workers watched, their livelihoods tied to this chess game. The speaker's refusal to spill details only heightened the tension. A nation left waiting, its faith in Trump's deal-making pitted against a dragon's cunning. The briefing pulsed forward, the speaker's gaze sweeping the room, ready for the next salvo. But the weight of these global fronts, Iran's defiance, Ukraine's scars, China's silence, hung like storm clouds. America stood tall, its spirit fierce, yet every question was a reminder. The fight against tyranny, whether in war or trade, demanded a vigilance that never slept. The nation, from its prairies to its cities, braced for what came next, united in a resolve to hold the line. The White House press room, a crucible still smoldering from the heat of global showdowns, pulsed with the relentless rhythm of a nation demanding answers. The speaker, a steadfast anchor amidst the storm of questions, stood poised at the podium, their voice a beacon for a country navigating the treacherous waters of power and promise. The air crackled with anticipation as reporters, emboldened by the weight of Iran, Ukraine, and China, pressed forward. Their queries a tapestry of America's hopes and fears. Each word exchanged was a spark, illuminating the fierce spirit of a people determined to hold their leaders to account, to resist the shadows of injustice that had too long lingered in the halls of influence. The barrage began with Turkey, a question about a potential meeting between Trump and its leader, sparked by rumors of a Middle East journey. The speaker's response was a deft sidestep, confirming only a Saudi Arabia trip, while leaving Turkey's place in the itinerary a tantalizing mystery. The room felt the tease, a diplomatic chess move unfolding in real time, with America's leverage in the region hanging in the balance. Beyond the briefing, in Florida's Turkish-American enclaves, families speculated over tea, wondering if their homeland would bend to Trump's will or stand defiant. This was a fight against the ambiguity that let power slip through cracks, a demand for clarity in a world of veiled intentions. Then came the president's health, a topic that struck at the nation's core. A reporter probed, would Trump's physician face the press? Would transparency extend to the former president's shadowed record. The speaker's answer was a clarion call. Trump's physical, a yearly ritual, would be laid bare, its results shared with a candor that shamed Biden's era of secrecy. They didn't mince words, calling the previous administration's silence a cover-up, a scandal that had mocked the public's trust. The room stirred, memories of whispered doubts about Biden's fitness resurfacing like ghosts. Across America, from Arizona, barbershops to Maine fishing docks, citizens nodded, weary of leaders who hid behind curtains. This was resistance against the abuse of opacity, a vow that power would answer to the people. Economic tremors followed, a question about Treasury bond yields, and whispers of China dumping assets to spike U.S. loan costs. The speaker deflected to the Treasury Department, but their mention of Secretary Scott Bessent's vigilance was a quiet reassurance, a sentinel watching the market's pulse. In Nebraska suburbs, homeowners fretted over mortgage rates, their dreams of stability tied to these unseen forces. The question was a reminder of the global stakes, a fight to shield America's economy from foreign machinations that wielded debt like a weapon. A whisper of progress broke the tension, an administration source hinting at a tariff deal mere weeks away, with over 15 offers already on the table. The speaker, careful not to outpace the trade team, radiated confidence, crediting Trump's advisors and his relentless drive. The room imagined the deals taking shape, factories humming in Alabama, ports bustling in Louisiana, a nation reclaiming its wealth. From Silicon Valley to the Rust Belt, workers sensed a tide turning, a rebellion against decades of trade policies that had hollowed out their towns. The speaker's words were a spark, fanning hope that America could dictate its destiny. Consumer confidence surfaced next, a reporter questioning its lag despite economic gains. The speaker's response was a sermon of optimism, recounting the CPI's plunge, energy prices tumbling, and investments flooding in. Trust in Trump, they urged. His first term, a blueprint for the boom to come. The nation heard it. In Texas oil fields, where rig workers toasted cheaper gas. In California startups, where founders eyed deregulation with glee. This was a call to arms against despair, a refusal to let past betrayals dim the American spirit. The speaker's conviction was a mirror to a country that had elected Trump overwhelmingly, its faith a bulwark against doubt. The briefing veered to the absurd, a bird attacking a reporter, a mouse skittering through the room, drawing chuckles that eased the strain. The speaker's humor, promising to check with the GSA, was a nod to the human under the policy, a moment of levity in a saga of weighty truths. Yet even this felt like defiance, a refusal to let chaos derail the mission. The room laughed, but their pens never stopped, capturing the promise of Trump's physical results, to be shared soon, a final act of openness. As the speaker closed, wishing all a great weekend, the press room exhaled, its walls holding the echo of a nation's pulse. Outside, America stood at a crossroads, trade deals simmering, wars teetering, trust rebuilding. From Montana's prairies to Miami's shores, the people watched, their spirit fierce, ready for the next chapter in a fight that demanded everything. The speaker stepped away, but the story didn't end. It lingered, a fire stoked, waiting to flare again come Monday.